Today, how energy cartels will smash the housing market. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, working on this post covering finance and property news with a distinctively Australian flavour. Today, I'm joined by David Llewellyn-Smith from Nucleus Wealth. Hi, David.
Hi, Martin. Good to see you.
Yeah, well, thanks very much for coming on. This is a really, really important conversation because it seems to me that nobody really is clear about what the energy thing is about, where it's going wrong, and why it's going to hit households. And frankly, it's a stuff up left, right, and centre, isn't it?
It is. It's a phenomenal stuff up, worthy of a tin pot third world country, Martin.
Okay, so are we a tin pot third world country, or are we just looking like one?
Well, they've certainly got a few things in common with a tin pot third world country, yes. And the way the kind of failure of our energy markets right now is more characteristic of that than anything I've seen previously. So. Yeah, it's an apt description at this point.
Right, and just to be clear, this isn't just a stuff up around Ukraine or even COVID, right? There's 20 or 30 years of policy failure on multiple fronts, which have basically led us to this point where, in fact, we can't necessarily keep the lights on, or if we do keep the lights on, we're paying through the nose for doing it.
Yes, pretty much. I mean, it's probably about the last 15 years it's really gone badly wrong. So yeah, it's many mistakes and a lot of very unethical behaviour and some very foggy thinking by a lot of people and some quite ruthless thinking by others. So shall we get into it?
I think we should. And look, this is going to be a bit of a no hold barred conversation because I think people need to understand just how the big power blocks, and I mean the energy companies as well as the politicians, have all had their finger in the pie here. And I think they've all lost sight of the fact that ultimately energy is about making sure that Australians, can go about their business and businesses can go about their business, rather than actually a whole set of other agendas which really are to the benefit of those particular power sectors rather than actually the broader Australian.
Yeah, quite right. I mean, I think of energy as actually the foundation stone of our civilization, Martin. So, if you put yourself in a position where you allow interest groups to steal it or distort its flows, then you really are messing with the foundations of your society in a way that's very unhealthy, and there will be major costs.
So let's go through it. Where did the problems start to go wrong? What was the catalyst, and how come we've ended up where we've ended up?
Okay, so you probably have to frame it in the climate change sense. The reason for that is, kind of into the late 90s, as climate change was becoming a key policy consideration around the world. The basic path forward that everybody took, or that was pretty logical to take, was that we were going to wean ourselves off coal generation for electricity and get ourselves onto renewables, basically. So to decarbonise the electricity network, and the basic bridge for that was gas. So because gas is very good at generating electricity and is a lot cleaner than coal, so it was, plus it's a kind of fuel that can create electricity very readily, very quickly, and a lot of it. Like coal, except coal doesn't actually react quickly. So gas is more useful than coal in that respect, but gas is much lower in carbon emissions, and so therefore if you were trying to get rid of coal, still needed lots of base load power, That is so that when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine, you've got your fallback. Then gas was going to be it. And pretty much everyone worldwide kind of set about down that path, including Australia. That was the plan. So use gas for sort of 20 odd years while you're building out your renewables and your power storage. Storage being, the backup, backup power when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine. And that will come in a variety of forms over time in the future, pumped hydro, batteries, etc. But gas was the bridging fuel that you could use to rapidly decarbonise whilst you built out all of that capacity. So that was all terrific, and Australia was incredibly well positioned to go through that transition. Probably the best position in the world, in fact, comfortably in the best position in the world, because we had both the best renewable assets in the world, brilliant sun, brilliant wind, etc. Plus, we had oodles of dirt cheap gas. So, we were absolutely sitting pretty to go through that transition. So that was all great until what happened kind of in the lead up to the GFC was we had this, wild commodity boom as China developed. And a component of that was, there were lots of breakthroughs in the production of gas in unconventional gas. Started in the US with fracking, with unconventional oil, shale oil, but it also then advanced into various other forms of extracting fossil fuels out of rocks, and that included coal seam gas in Australia in particular. Now, these gas reserves had always been locked up in the past because they didn't really have a commercial way of extracting them, but through that GFC period, new technologies developed that enabled them to do it. So we got post-GFC, and suddenly there were these huge investment decisions made around extracting these enormous coal seam gas reserves that we have in Australia that were very cheap. Most of them are in Victoria. There are some others, in Queensland. There is some elsewhere around the country, but the big ones are in Queensland. Moreover, they're very, very conveniently placed near the coast in Queensland, and so you could build LNG plants to ship that gas, freeze it, and ship it to Asia. So it was really the birth of a new export industry that transpired just after the GFC. And this is, your readers might remember that we had, a lot of rate rises, surprisingly enough, through that period. And Australia was thumping along. The economy was booming with this huge commodity investment. And by far the largest component of that wasn't iron ore or coal, although they were very big. It was gas. It was gas in Queensland, where there was something like $100 billion invested in these LNG export plants. Plus a whole heap more in the Northern Territory and WA. So, that was actually the lion's share of the investment that came in that period. So here we are sailing along towards our decarbonisation plan, and suddenly we've gotten 6 LNG trains. A train is just a process through which the gas goes to be frozen to go onto a ship to be sailed overseas. So suddenly 6 of these trains were built on Curtis Island near Gladstone in Queensland. There was no real approval process for it because Australia doesn't have that kind of commodity management regime, at least not on the East Coast. What the various companies that invested simply had to put in there, acquire the reserves, and then put in their environmental approval submissions, etc. And that's a very low bar to get these projects off the ground. And nobody really considered how these two things went together. That is, on one hand, our decarbonisation plan that was reliant on gas, and this sudden enormous investment that came in, most of it from offshore, to freeze that gas and take it to Asia, as a trade play. Because there was no real regime to manage our commodities, nobody actually put those two things together and said, well, they don't really work together. And so, then around 2014, when these LNG plants were built and started to ship the gas, lo and behold, Eastern Australia found itself in a state of chronic gas shortage, and the price started to rise. So by the time we hit 2017, it had risen from a traditional $3 a gigajoule to about 20, and it was dramatically hollowing out a lot of manufacturing. At that point, it had started to also affect the manufacturers. By the way, I should say, are using gas directly, not necessarily through electricity, but it also started to raise the electricity prices because gas is the marginal cost fuel in the national energy market, which I could go into in greater detail. But basically, there's a bid auction system where various different types of electricity production bid to supply whatever the demand is, and gas is always the most expensive, and so it sets the price for everybody. So as that price rose, the electricity prices started to rise too, and so there was a rather sensible panic in 2017 when Malcolm Turnbull was the Prime Minister. Excuse me, and he reacted by installing a form of what we call domestic reservation, which is to just basically say, well, a certain amount of gas has to be here and sold locally before you export it, and that worked quite well. It took a little while, but effectively drove down the price back to under $10, and then we had a lot of new gas production around the world, and the price kept falling and went back to sort of, $5 or $6 for a while. And then, we're coming into COVID, and obviously everything fell apart and what have you. And so it looked like we were okay again for a little while, but that was a falsehood. We weren't okay at all. Basically, the moment there was any kind of new disruption to gas supply, then the guys who were shipping it offshore would once again just tighten the market, let prices rise, and so this started to happen all through last year. Prices were going up, and then of course we've had the Ukraine war, which has just sent the global gas price through the roof, because Russia has squeezed Europe as an act of war, basically. To try and make it bow to its wishes. It's stopped sending its gas to Europe, or has curtailed it at least. And so Europe became desperate for gas. That took LNG out of the international market. Then Asia became desperate for gas and was chasing it. And so suddenly all of our export gas, the price was skyrocketing. And then because we'd connected the local market to the export market, the global markets had basically started setting the price for local gas. And so we reached recently $40 a gigajoule. And it's only $40 a gigajoule, quite frankly, because the regulator stepped in and capped it. Otherwise, it could be anything now, because there's nothing else stopping the export cartel from continuing to just export more and more of it. And, essentially creating an artificial shortage at home through which they're gouging, basically. So that's your basic story. So, who's to blame here? Whose fault is it, and how do we fix it? Undoubtedly, governments played a big role and made a lot of mistakes here. But I think the key mistakes are not those of government. So the main error was by the gas companies themselves. They overestimated their gas reserves, basically, when they built these enormous export facilities. In particular, Santos is at fault here, because they originally only planned for one train, like half the capacity that they ended up with. And when they added a second, there were quite a few questions asked by politicians and media, etc. Do you have enough gas? And they said yes. And they said the same thing. They all said the same thing in their environmental impact statements. They all had their own reserves, enough of their own captured reserves to fill these export trains and send the gas offshore, and therefore there was plenty of gas left for local use. It wouldn't affect the local price. Meanwhile, they were busy telling their investors that if they were wrong, the local gas price would go through the roof and that they'd make a lot of money. So they were playing, a double hand, right? And of course, what happened was their gas reserves turned out to be much smaller than they thought. The coal seam gas process was not as effective as they thought. And Santos in particular found itself very short of gas. So what it did, it immediately went out into the wider gas market, domestic market, and bought up all the available reserves, right? The stuff that it said it would never need, it just went and bought it all. And that included stuff as far south as the Gippsland JV, which is formerly Exxon and BHP, now Exxon and Woodside, which is Bass Strait gas. So even Bass Strait gas, which has been, singularly beneficial to Victoria, but also New South Wales, it's been exported for many, many years around the states, has been heading up to Queensland and out to sea for since 2014. Not all the time, but regularly enough. And so the gas cartel that I think of as basically the 3 LNG export plants, and that includes the local owners of Santos and Origin, and then there's a bunch of part owners that include both Japanese, Korean, and in particular Chinese interests. The Chinese state-owned enterprises are very large owners. And then I think you should add Exxon and Woodside because they're a lot of their reserves have kind of been sucked into that export supply chain. And so they're part of the problem as well, not really part of the solution anymore.
And just a quick point there. That means that those excess profits, most of those go offshore, don't they? Most of those don't stay in Australia.
100%.
Yeah.
Like 97%, something
Yep.
like that. Yep.
Yep.
And moreover, and this is another, like this is an endless violation of the Australian national interest, this story. It's non-stop. And every Australian within it. Another component of, as I said, large Chinese ownership, and roughly 70% of the volumes on the East Coast are going to China. So, as China has just completed its third spanking new aircraft carrier, it's doing deals in the Solomon Islands, trying to build military installations to put us over a barrel. And effectively, force us into their vision of an illiberal Chinese Pacific or Asia Pacific empire. We're starving our manufacturing base of gas and giving it to the Chinese to build their economy and capacity to project power straight back down to us, whilst we're charging ourselves these unbelievable prices and therefore sending all of our manufacturing broke. And of course, manufacturing is much larger than your military industrial base, but we're certainly not doing our ability to defend ourselves any favours. So the companies are largely to blame here on this. Again, I'll reiterate, there is no formal process of approval. I accept that, fine. But there are still undertakings here made through their environmental impact statements and just their public statements, which are on the record, that show that, they simply overinvested in their gas capacity, in their gas export capacity, and have thus created an artificial shortage for Australia, for the east coast of Australia. So the government, of course, is culpable in the sense that it should have seen this coming, back when these projects were planned, and it should have done exactly what Western Australia did, of course, which everybody now knows was they demanded 15% of that newly extracted gas be sold locally with domestic reservation. And so while we have a $40 gas price, they have $5.50, which is just absurd, right? Completely absurd. So, that's kind of all been history, and there have been many attempts to kind of rectify it. As I said, Malcolm Turnbull tried Senator Rex Patrick tried again in 2019 when he had Scott Morrison over a barrel over his $158 billion worth of tax cuts. And he needed Senator Rex Patrick's signature to pass those. And those are the big tax cuts for the rich that, are still debated and still coming, I think, in 2023, 24. And he got a written guarantee from Scott Morrison that he would toughen domestic reservation. And he had the government over a barrel, and he had the insight and integrity to choose what to spend that political capital on, and he chose fixing the gas problem. And that's because this is so fundamental to everything. The media is hopeless on this. They don't understand it. They're not even interested. I'm not sure why. I think it's too sophisticated, and it's hard to continue to keep the story running day after day. I mean, we manage it at Macrobusiness, but the broader media is just too flighty for it. And so it comes back to it every time there's a crazy crisis like we've just been through, but it just can't mount any consistent pressure. And the irony of that, of course, is that the media as an interest in itself is really badly affected by this relentless kind of gas gouge. Okay, so that's gas. Like, that was a huge problem that we've had running for the better part of a decade.
Just one question, because I know that the new government, and I think the Prime Minister said, well, we can't do much about this because of the, quote, sovereign risk if we started to tackle it.
Yeah, the reason we should talk about that now is because that really comes down to who's responsible.
Yep.
And the companies are responsible. So how is it sovereign risk? They created the risk when they overinvested and overestimated their gas reserves and made those public undertakings. Not a formal process, but certainly public undertakings that reassured policymakers. They did those things, and it just didn't turn out that way. And there is moreover evidence that they were telling their investors that it may not work out that way, but the investors will be happy anyway because the local price will skyrocket, right?
Yep.
So the companies created this risk. The sovereign did not. Yes, it made some mistakes and it should have stopped them from doing it, but the companies put one over on us, basically. And so, first of all, you have to go back to first principles, I think, and just say, well, you're going to have proper accounting here, and that is that these companies have misallocated capital, essentially. By doing so, they've broken the local energy markets. And so any proper accounting of that means that the responsibility is sheeted back to them. And you do that simply by applying retrospective domestic reservation, or there are a number of other mechanisms you could use. But you basically, they have to wear the cost, not everybody else. And so the notion of sovereign risk there, I find, is pretty absurd. Because these companies, some of these companies are national champions of China, national champions of Korea, national champions of Japan. We're not even talking about private sector interests here. We're talking about foreign governments half the time in state-owned enterprises, and we're talking about sovereign risk. I mean, they've come in and misallocated capital. Everybody on the east coast of Australia is paying for it.
Yep.
That's risk to the sovereign, Martin. It's not sovereign risk.
Yeah,
it's completely upside down.
Yeah.
And so there is not only no sovereign risk, there is risk to the sovereign, and you therefore have every right to act forcefully to apply whatever regime you need to fix it. And if they lose money as a result of that, that's their damn problem. So this kind of gets us up to the Ukraine war. And then obviously once the Ukraine war happened, and more importantly, the sanction regime was applied to Russia, Russia's just an enormous energy exporter of everything, right? Huge in oil, huge in gas, and huge in coal, especially into Europe. And so once those sanctions have been applied, and they're still being applied, they're not even fully rolled out yet. Like in coal, for instance, Europe doesn't even ban Russian coal until August. But the end result basically was all of those energy prices all went through the roof. And so we now have a problem with coal as well. Like we've got, more coal than taking it to Newcastle, right? But our coal price at home now is ludicrous as well. Like it's now $400 or $500. Traditionally, it was 60 to 80, right? For all the same reasons. Now, that is international prices filtering back to Australia. But that we haven't even talked about electricity yet. Oh my God. So the reason I'm raising coal is what this is really about. So the gas market was one thing, but that's largely a problem. It's a small component of utility bills for households. That in direct gas usage, it's largely a problem for manufacturing. Okay, so that's a strategic problem for your country if you're going to allow your manufacturing to go out of business. And you could choose to, but it seems to me pretty silly to do that, especially given, the kind of rising geopolitical risk environment. So then the secondary problem with gas, and this is much more expensive, this problem, is that it sets the price of electricity in the national electricity market, which is the East Coast market. But it doesn't do it uniformly everywhere. Between the coal that we export, which is black coal, and the gas that we export, gas is most important in setting the electricity price in South Australia and Victoria. It certainly plays a big role in the other states too, but most important in those, largely because they have more renewables, and also because Victoria has brown coal, which is not exported and so is not exposed to expensive prices. But New South Wales and Queensland are very dependent on black coal still. They haven't developed as many renewables, and Queensland is the irony of ironies, being the home of a lot of the coal and heaps of the gas, and certainly the gas export facilities. Queensland is completely dependent on both black coal and gas. And so the electricity prices everywhere have gone up, gone crazy, so crazy that the regulator again was forced to step in a couple of weeks ago and cap prices at crazy prices, I might add. Like they don't cap them at low prices. They kept them on the ceiling, not on the floor. So the Ukraine war, by making all of these things super expensive, so we've had a failed gas market essentially since 2014. And since the Ukraine war, the astronomical price of gas and coal has broken the national electricity market as well. Because firstly, the fuel costs that drive it, gas and coal, set the marginal costs, have gone from, traditionally we had a megawatt hour price of like $25. It had been creeping up over the last few years because of the gas issues and stuff to roughly 50. Now, the regulator was forced to cap it at 300 a few weeks ago. They put it back on, turned it back on last Friday, and it's back at 500. We're talking these extraordinary 500, 1,000% price rises in these fundamental inputs that go into everything. They go into every business in the country. They're not a huge cost for most businesses or a lot of businesses. They are for manufacturing, but they are a substantial cost for a lot of businesses. Everyone's got to put the lights on and use electricity and what have you. Plus households, of course, have utility bills. And so it evens out in the CPI. It ends up being about 3% of the CPI is utility bills, which doesn't sound like much, right?
That's just the direct element though, right? It's all the flow on.
Yes, that's the direct element.
Yeah.
And then everyone tries to pass that on. So we call that 3 to 5, right, in total. It could be higher. I don't know. It could be a bit lower, but it's somewhere 3, 4, 5% of the CPI that is going to double over the next year or two.
Mm.
Now, this is the problem, right? This is the real crisis for the economy. You already have the Reserve Bank on the march, right, with interest rates. You already have a whole lot of supply chain price inflows into the Australian economy driving inflation up. The wages story we think is largely bullshit. We don't think it's wages. I think it's international prices largely.
Mm.
And now you're going to add 3 to 5% to the CPI over the next 12 to 18 months via energy, by doubling its cost, right? Which essentially that's doubling its cost at the retail level, I should say. Like the wholesale prices that have gone up 500, 600%, they're only end up being 20% of your actual bill, your power bill. Most of it goes to other stuff, poles and wires and retailers and stuff. But you're still, because the gouging is so enormous, you are going to double that 3%, that 3 to 5%. So you're giving yourself an unbelievable inflation shock at exactly the wrong moment, when the RBA is already chasing international prices that it can't affect. And it can't affect the energy prices either, right? It's chasing this pointlessly because these prices are coming from offshore. It could annihilate the Australian economy, render it zero, and these prices would not change. We'd still be paying through the nose for energy, right? Because they're just being set globally. So it's an absurd situation for the RBA to be in. It's just the timing of it is terrible, because it's on the march, hiking rates, trying to front load this monetary tightening cycle to stomp on inflation on prices it can't affect. Right? But it's going to affect other prices that it can affect without actually bringing down inflation much. So, obviously this is where your lead in about housing comes in, where the RBA is going to overcook rate hikes on the basis of this stuff. It will be forced to if it's not changed, even if house prices keep falling, which would traditionally spill over reasonably quickly to consumption, as we know, and housing construction, and would start to see unemployment rise and inflation go through the floor. Now, that will still happen, but it'll be offset by this energy shock that'll just keep going if the prices stay where they are. Now, I think they probably will. We're also kind of trending towards some kind of global recession, I think, and so a lot of the international prices that have been lifting in Australia are going to reverse and go down, especially on goods. So that's good news, and that will help the RBA. But I don't think the energy prices are going to fall, because every time they look like doing so, Russia just turns another tap off to Europe.
Yes.
Then global prices go nuts again. So I think high coal and gas prices are here to stay for a couple of years while the global supply side kind of works out new arrangements. This is the situation we've gotten ourselves into as a country, where foreign energy cartels are delivering a war profiteering income shock to the entire East Coast economy. And when I say East Coast, I mean everybody west of the WA border, east of the WA border, as we're in a monetary policy tightening cycle. And house prices are already falling. And so this is just a very, very nasty cocktail. And so something like 50 billion is going to be ripped out the economy just on the electricity and gas prices. Then whatever the RBA does on top of that, if it goes anywhere near what markets are saying, then that's probably another 30, 40 billion in increased interest payments. So we're up to kind of JobKeeper level unstimulus. Money going out, right? And then you're going to have a dramatic wealth effect as well, coming out of deflating house prices. And so it's just it's ludicrous. It's actually ludicrous. It's a ludicrous situation. Now, the reason it's most ludicrous is that it can be fixed with a pen in like 1 minute. And this is where we come to the policy errors of the past and our new government, Albanese government. Is it going to do something about this? Because the answer is really, really simple. You either just domestically reserve enough gas and coal to drive the local price down and essentially dislocate the prices from the international prices, or you apply an export levy, which is an even better idea, because what that would do is collect all of the windfall gains that these companies are enjoying from war profiteering, because that's what this is about.
Yep.
Prices are only up because of the war. And so that's a windfall gain to which the companies actually have no right. And so if you put an export levy on, the Australian Treasury would collect all of that revenue that they're making. And so it'll be an enormous budget windfall, and you should shove that into a sovereign wealth fund or save it for future generations in one form or another. Or you can do super profits taxes. Right? They're all effectively doing the same thing. And if you did the super profits tax, you're just taking the money back, and you would recycle some of that as subsidies for energy bills.
Yep.
Right? And all three mechanisms just achieve the same outcome, although the last two actually collect a lot of revenue for the country as well. So they're but they're like, if you're getting into a super profits tax, you're starting to look at a lot of inefficiency, right? Because you're collecting the money, then you've got to figure out who to give it to and whatever. The best solution is actually just an export levy, because that would crash the local price, collect all the revenue for the Australian government, and we'd instantly have none energy crisis. We'd have no energy crisis, none. You will have heard many people talk about, there's lots of old coal-fired power generators offline and all this other claptrap. It's all bullshit, right? Yes, there are a few offline and they've been underinvested in for obvious reasons, privatisation partly, but also decarbonisation, whatever. But there's heaps of spare capacity in the NEM. There's oodles. So, people will say it's the weather, the cold weather has boosted demand, and yes, absolutely, that's the case. But I mean, do you really have an electricity system that can't handle cold weather? Is that really why you have an electricity system? So that when it gets cold, you got to turn the heater off. So all that's largely crap. In fact, really, I would say the only problem is the fuel cost of gas and coal, and you've got to fix those two things, and then essentially what would happen is we'd go back to the original plan, which is gas would be the bridging fuel while you built out your renewables and your power storage to replace coal and baseload power over time, and it would just go smoothly like clockwork, because all the market incentives to invest in all that renewable stuff are now 100% in place. Now, if you don't do it, that's going to dramatically accelerate. I'm not arguing that's the case, because what this is in effect is like the largest carbon tax the universe has ever seen. Private carbon tax, we should say. It's not actually a tax. It's a tax, levied by a cartel. And so it'll certainly accelerate the decarbonisation transformation, but it will at the same time cost you so much money in lost income and wealth, households and wider Australian business, that is preposterous.
Yep.
Like, it's actually shocking, the whole idea. So, those are your three answers, and it's just a simple matter of political will. This is where you come back to the question of sovereign risk. There is none. It's risk to the sovereign. It's extraordinary risk to the sovereign. And if the Albanese government isn't prepared to act on it, then you should all vote them out. Like, it's really that straightforward, because this is the most fundamentally basic national interest policy question I've seen in my lifetime.
Yeah.
Like, this is just as plain as day what should be done. And there is some movement about where of it might go that way. Like, Treasurer Chalmers has tossed it to the ACCC and said, can you have a look at what we should do? They're reviewing Malcolm Turnbull's domestic reservation levers and seeing how that can be improved. And I think they're going to get there with a bunch of measures eventually, but they're just far too timid.
It's a very obvious next question, which is, why are they so timid? Why is it that this blindingly obvious thing to do, and by the way, it would keep the Reserve Bank from lifting so high and doing all those things, it would actually make a whole lot of sense. Why would they not want to do this?
They're afraid of the miners, is what it boils down to.
Right.
This comes back to Kevin Rudd and his super profits tax in 2010. When he tried to levy a new big tax on iron ore mostly, but some coal as well. As we know, that campaign, although if you look at the polling back in through that period, I think you'll find that Rudd was actually winning that debate. He ended up being stabbed in the back by his own party, lost power. And when Julia Gillard rose as the new Prime Minister, she and Treasurer Wayne Swan just invited, I think it was BHP Rio and the Minerals Council, don't quote me on that, but I think it was those three, were invited into the cabinet room where they wrote their own tax policy just to stop the crisis.
Yep.
Now, that scarred Labor very, very deeply. Obviously, Julia Gillard nearly lost the election, and then they lost power 3 years later, largely, I think, because they were seen as illegitimate because of all the backstabbing and everything that had gone on. So it cost Labor power, in effect, trying to levy a super profits tax on iron ore. And so they're deeply scarred and terrified of trying to take it on again. I would argue, though, that there are some very distinct differences this time around that means that if, in effect, they're fighting the last war, which is usually what politicians do, let's face it, principally, it is, when you're levying a tax on iron ore was, kind of levying a tax on Australia's national champions, like, I don't know if you remember Gina Reinhardt and Twiggy Forrest standing on the back of a ute and, with a loud hailer and, cursing the evils of Canberra and what have you. And that resonated with Australians, I think, and so even though Rudd was, I think, winning that debate ultimately, it certainly showed badly in the polls, like his polls were hit. And I think that resonated with Australians. And so, there was real concern about that, I guess, in the community, some real concern. But this is something else. Like, we were talking then about a few billion in, lost share market profits. This time we're talking about your utilities bills doubling, your mortgage rate going through the roof, and your house price going down much more than it would otherwise. So you have three incredible motivations in the community to embrace, one of the three policy mechanisms that would fix it overnight. And moreover, it's a blood-sucking, planet-destroying foreign cartel. It is not local national champions. We're talking, and heaps of it's Chinese owned, and most of the gas is going to China as well.
So this is an existential decision, isn't it? I mean, it's that serious. It's an existential decision.
Oh, absolutely it is. Yeah. I think this could cost the Albanese government power.
Yep.
Because we know what the opposition will do with it. because they've done it non-stop for 10 years. They'll blame renewables. So they'll blame the decarbonisation process and try and derail it. And so, what was one of the core platforms of the Albanese government election? And they'll be able to just pull that from, just say they cocked it up. They don't know what they're doing.
Yeah.
And they'd be right about not knowing what they're doing. It's just that that's not the thing that they don't know what they're doing about. Like, that would just be, more ruthless politicking. So for me, the answer is very clear. The upside, conversely, if you look at it in the positive sense, if they do find the cojones to do it, then I think this makes the government. Like, this can put them into power for 3 terms, because this would wreck the Liberal Party, wreck it. They'd fix all of Australia's energy problems with the stroke of a pen.
Yep.
The decarbonisation process would march forward, bills would collapse. And where is Peter Dutton then? He and his cronies are exposed as the frauds they have been for 10 years over the whole carbon price and decarbonisation process. So, I mean, they're not thinking straight.
And the point there too also is that it means that the interest rates wouldn't go up as high. The Reserve Bank would be able to get inflation back within its 2 to 3% target. So we can sort of go on in a more normal fashion, right? And not get wrecked, which otherwise will happen.
Where's the downside for the Albanese government? I mean, the other possible explanation is corruption, of course, because they do pay some very large, donations. Let's call them what they really are, bribes. They paid some very large bribes to the Labor Party, just as they paid some very large bribes to the Morrison government.
Yep.
That's the oil and gas cartels. So that gets them on the inside of the policy tent, and then they can spread their poison in there, and they do. And I've seen some of the material that they spread through Parliament, and you wouldn't call it lies, but you probably would call it propaganda. Like, it's very distorted material. And so, here we are, Martin.
A critical point of decision. Great that you've been able to share it and just outline it so clearly. And the point of decision is so straightforward, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Look, that's the thing about energy, which is quite frustrating when you know enough about it. It's not complex. It's actually relatively straightforward. But when you look at it from the outside, it looks unbelievably complex, right? And so I think this is one of the reason the media really struggles to cover it, because it's hard to write authoritatively about it when you're, tangled up in so many wires that you don't know where they originate from and where they go, and you're afraid you're going to cut the blue wire and you should cut the red, But
and also the industry is not trying necessarily to be as transparent as you'd want it to be either, right? There's the whole agenda, right?
Putting it mildly there.
Yeah.
So it is actually very straightforward. This crisis is about coal and gas prices, and you can fix it overnight. And if you don't, the consequences are really bad for everybody else. I mean, you're literally talking 12 companies or something, 12 or 15 companies. Like, oh no, there's more than that. I'm sorry, in coal. Like, there's the gas cartels, like 6 companies, and coal's a little bit more fragmented, and so you got to think about how you'd handle that. But it's all eminently doable. The only problem is politics.
Well, David, I want to say thank you very much for sharing that with us. It's been a real education and a really important conversation. And I think I'd like to maybe get you to come back on one of our live shows in a few weeks' time and, take some questions from the audience and take the conversation further. But we'll make sure that the message gets out there, right?
Yeah. It'd be an absolute pleasure. I've been actually telling this story at, around dinner tables for nearly 10 years and watching jaws drop into their dinner. Like, it's so crazy. It's like this slow motion national suicide.
Absolutely. Well, the point is there is a red button there, and if you push the red button, you can solve it, right?
Yeah,
that's the point.
That's right. Yeah, yeah. I'm not sure it's even red, Mark. I think it might be a green button.
Okay, even better, a green button. I'm colorblind. Yeah, exactly.
That's right. So yes, love to come back. Be
Yeah.
thrilled to answer questions.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for your time today. Really appreciate it, and we'll get you back on in the next few weeks. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.